Hi, this is Paul, and I have a couple of special guests today. I've known them for a while now, and those of you on the Discord server know Kathryn, and this is her husband, Eamon. And I've spoken with Eamon quite a bit over the last couple of years, and Kathryn a bit on the Discord server and some of the randos conversations that we've done. I wanted to have them both in because we talk a fair amount about deconstruction, and someone in a comment section said, in what way does trauma figure into all of this? And I thought, oh, I know just two people I'd love to talk to about that, because both of these individuals, well, I'll let you guys introduce yourselves. So why don't you go for it?
All right. Well, I'm Eamon, and I grew up in a small town in Northern Ontario, and I'm a clinical psychologist currently, but I had no plans on becoming a psychologist really until I was, I guess, close to like 27 or 28. I grew up in a small Baptist church as well, and there were a lot of good things that came from that, and a lot of things that came from that have been complicated. And one of the things that drew me to Paul's channel and to Pajot and Peterson, been that they've engaged with sort of where does the church fit, how does it engage and with people who are wrestling with faith. Want me to say a little bit about kind of how I got from point A to point B?
Well, it's interesting because you're not only a clinical psychologist, you also have a significant amount of education in theology.
Yes. Yeah, that was an interesting road as well. My background was actually in business. When I was doing my undergraduate degree, my plan was to join a family business, which is really office equipment and copiers and stuff like that. So I was working, I guess, full-time eventually as a youth pastor in Thunder Bay, just because I'd always been interested in people and had been involved in the church. And I mean, there were a couple of things from my past. I had an uncle who committed suicide, and we had a death in our youth group when I was a youth pastor there, that really brought up questions both about faith and about mental health and where does the church fit into all this. And I ended up going down to the States for seminary, to Westminster Theological Seminary, in part because of some of the crisis that came from dealing especially with the death in the youth group. I remember talking to different pastors in Thunder Bay and asking them, what do I say to this family? What do I say to these brothers who just lost their brother over just in really strange circumstances? And the answer that I heard from several of them was, this is sort of the realm of counseling and therapy, and when you go to seminary, you maybe get a handful of classes on this, and they gave some practical advice about giving people space, getting all the youth together in one place and giving them a chance to speak. But anyone who's gone through something like that knows it's like that's good, and now that the ministry begins in a lot of ways, because people are understandably distressed. So Westminster, they have a counseling program, a track with their Masters of Divinity. And that's really what drew me down there, was being able to get a theological education that was also heavy on counseling. And that's really what brought me down. And then that led to even more questions. Actually, it didn't end there. Halfway through my MDiv, I realized that I wanted to learn more about psychology, in part practical reasons, where I knew that if I was going to move back to Northern Ontario, being a Christian counselor was probably not viable. And then, especially in sort of Old Westminster, one of the sort of traditions there was people getting an MDiv and then studying a different field and engaging with that as a Christian and trying to study at the highest level they could. And there was a guy at our church, in our small group, who was just finishing up his doctorate in clinical psych, who had also got his MDiv. And so he sort of helped me navigate that. That's that's how I ended up, as a psychologist. My time at Widener University was fantastic. It was interesting seeing a lot of parallels between the conflict between different schools of thought at seminary and in the psychological world. You have people who are very, very opinionated about psychodynamic approaches or CBT, all sorts of modalities. What I did see at Widener, which I found to be really encouraging and stimulating, was they would regularly have conversations between the different professors who were from different theoretical orientations, because there was an interest in really trying to help people. That practical element was definitely present. I believe all the faculty there, they were required to be actively in practice as well. So you have the nice connection between theory and practice being wedded together, meaning that you were aware of the research that was out there, but you were always encouraged to critically evaluate it. And there was an epistemic humility that was definitely appreciated.
And Kathryn, your brother made it onto the channel before you did by quite a ways. And I'll put a link to his conversation. Is there somebody recently went through like most of the conversations and would leave comments in them, because that's really the treasure trove of this channel, are all the conversations. And like Kathryn, we never gotten into your story. I mean, I don't know how much you've shared it on the Discord server. So why don't you share a little bit about how you've arrived here?
Well, if you weave together my brother and my husband, you probably got 90% of it. But I was born in Thunder Bay, so northwestern Ontario. But my parents moved to southern Ontario when I was really young, like 1 or 2. And then my dad was in business down there until I was probably 7 or 8, and then they got into full-time ministry. So from there we moved around a little bit. I think I went to a different high school every year.
Wow.
It was a lot. It was a mixed bag of ministries. So it was camping ministries at first. They were with the Canadian Sunday School Mission. So we did one camp for 1 year, went to another one for 5 years. And then they decided to start a discipleship program and tried to found a church. And then they decided to go down to California and Apple Valley, California. And my mom took a role as a pastor down there. And then a year later, we went up to Manitoba and they started another program there. And then my grandpa got quite ill. So we moved back to Thunder Bay when I was going into grade 12.
Okay.
So very much that like ministry oriented life. My parents, so I feel like there's about 2 tracks that missionaries and pastors take with their kids. There's either the one track where it's like, we're all in this together, kids. We're all doing ministry. Everybody's, pulling the line. And then there's the track where they're like, my kids won't be affected by this. They're going to be in every sports program. I'll be to every recital. And my parents were the first one. It was like, okay, kids, we're doing this. So from the time I was little, 11, all summer, I'd be in the kitchen cooking for the kids or helping to lead the games. And, in the winter, there'd be VBS and after school programs. So when I was 12, I got given a group of a dozen kids and it's like, okay, teach them the Bible and they need to have these verses memorized and you've got 20 minutes and okay. So for me, the counseling and caring track, we sort of take responsibility for the care of other people. That started pretty early on.
Okay. When did you two meet?
When I was in grade 12.
Yeah, we met in 2001.
Yeah.
Please tell me you weren't her youth pastor.
Goodness, no.
Just want to be sure.
Hey, it happens. It's true.
Lord have mercy.
No, I wasn't a youth pastor till after we were married.
I just wanted to be sure.
We did do ministry together, though. We both helped at a youth ministry, but he wasn't over me. So that was
no. Well, and I think we ended up doing more stuff probably at Saturday Night Live. Probably. Yeah. It was a ministry at actually where the Urban Abbey is now.
That my dad founded.
Yeah, where they would open up the church on Saturday nights and just invite all the homeless in and feed them, and there'd be a little bit of music and a short message. But yeah, I think that's probably where we ended up doing the most together.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, did you wind up, because you took off on an education track, and I mean, how did this happen a little bit?
Okay. So we met that year. Eamon was in Thunder Bay for the year. So we knew each other that year. We were doing some ministry, but then he went off and he did an internship in Minneapolis.
Yeah.
So he took off. We had some mixed signals. So he thought I wasn't interested. I thought he wasn't interested, but we both still were, and it just kind of died. And we thought, okay. While he was gone, I moved out of my parents' house, lived on my own a bit, started going to university. I wanted to be a doctor, which was still my plan until I got pregnant. I was like, I'll be a doctor, and I wanted to be a missionary. I wanted to just be like jungle doctor, live out of a backpack, set broken bones kind of thing. That was my track. And then Eamon had a buddy who was coming back to Thunder Bay.
He just needed a ride.
He just needed a ride. And I heard he was coming to town. And at that point, I think it was my second year of university, but I heard he was coming to town. So I was like, oh, Eamon, I wonder what he's been up to. So I drove out to where I knew he was going to be, and he walked through the door, and I was like, oh, this is it. This is it. I have to marry Eamon. It was just like, oh, I got to marry him. So then I went on the pursuit. I was like hounding him. So I went over.
Well, you knew what kind of movies I like. So she got me to stay later, even though I had gone with a friend and put on Jean-Claude Van Damme classic, The Quest.
I lured him in. I knew he couldn't say no.
I was more interested in you than the movie, but it was a nice excuse to hang around.
On Claude Van Damme.
Yeah. And then I started writing him letters, and how long until we started dating?
I think it was only like 2 months.
Mm-hmm.
2 months later, we started dating, and then a few months after that, we got engaged. Yeah.
And I told him, I was like, when we started dating, I was like, if we're not married within a year, I'm out. I was like, I got a track. I got somewhere I'm going. And if this isn't going, then,
I think you said, if we don't know by then what are we doing?
Yeah.
I like this. This is good.
So we did. We, got married within a year, and Eamon was in business school at that time.
Yeah.
Because when we started dating, he was going to school in Manitoba.
Yeah.
So then he moved over. That's another complicated story.
Yeah. Yeah. Then I moved over to
Thunder
Lakehead, Thunder Bay.
Yeah. And I was still going to be a doctor, but then 3 months in, got pregnant. We were going to wait 8 years. And it was like, God had different plans.
Wait 8 years.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow.
When I was 28, I would be a doctor with an established practice. I could set my own hours, and that would be like an ideal situation. And that didn't work out. And obviously I'm not a doctor. So I let that one go. But
so did you have your kids? Were you dragging your kids all through this educational track, Eamon?
Oh yeah. Yeah, we were. And when I look back, I think we were only able to do it because we were young.
Yeah.
At Lakehead, the way they work it is they don't charge you, or at least when we were there, they didn't charge you any more for tuition over 4 courses. So at the end there, I was like, you know what? I'll sign up for, I worked at my schedule around my job and everything. And I thought, I'll just sign up for 8 courses. I'll see if I can get them done. And if I don't, if I drop them before it affects my GPA, then, at least I gave it a shot, because I was feeling the pressure of like, okay, we have a kid and I want to get this education thing done. And so it was like every minute of every day was scheduled. It was like, go to class, time to read, time to hang out with Kathryn and our son. Actually, one of the ways we connected during that time, there's a Canada Games complex, and the childcare was super cheap. So the way we would connect and get exercise in is we drop him off and we'd play squash for like an hour, and did that all the time. so yeah, kept sane and just pushed through. So, and then had
So we had-
finally 2 weeks before we moved down to Philadelphia.
that
Okay.
sucked. That sucked a lot
Yeah.
because I had the baby, and then Eamon moved down early, brought down our stuff, went with our
Yep.
his sister,
Started summer Greek.
started
Yeah.
Greek, set up house a little bit, and then about 2 weeks later, I followed with the baby. And did Bert go with you, or did he come with me?
He came with you.
He came with me.
Yeah, he came with you.
And then 2 years later, I had Rowan, who was our last. So they were all 2 years apart. And I was in the, so I finished my BA at Lakehead before, well, not before we left. I still had a couple courses I had to do online. But when we went down, Westminster had a scholarship, which was amazing. So as many courses as Eamon took, I could take for free.
It's a spousal
Wow.
scholarship. So we looked
amazing.
at it like, wow, you get a free master's
Even
Yeah.
even for credit, not just auditing or
Only
anything.
for credit.
for
Yeah.
credit.
Wow.
Which is amazing. So I had been thinking I'll just stay at home with the kids and we'll go to school. But then when I got presented with a free master's, I was like, well, I'd be an idiot to turn that down. I still wasn't
Yeah.
thinking about doing counseling at that time, but I was like, I don't want to do an MDiv. Languages just sounds not my
Well,
ballpark.
and with the master's, we figured it was like, well, my degree is 4 years. You know, they joke it's the Masters of Infinity. And Kathryn, the counseling degree was 2 years. And so we thought, well, you just spread that out over, 3 or 4 years and
Go part-time.
yeah, go part-time.
I did a lot of night classes.
Yeah, there's a
Wow.
lot of like, I come back from class and then we just pass off the kids.
It's been
And then you'd be
crazy
back at, like,
years.
9:30. Yeah.
Yeah. So we were burning the candle at both ends. It was a lot of like working on papers till 3 a.m. and then up with the kids at 6. And
And there were some awesome people at the church, and then people who got to know at seminary that there were times where both of us were sick and they really came through. So
Yeah.
It wouldn't have been possible without them.
Let's talk a little bit about faith journey and faith formation, because both of you were raised in the church. Both of you fairly early on got involved, not just, let's say, got involved in active ministry in the church. Especially Kathryn, your story, boy, missionary kids who, as you say, get recruited into the cause. There's, I know some people that was their life and they are bitter. And, we're going to talk about trauma a little while. They very much experience all of that as, traumatic. So how both of you came out the other end of this, not only as Christians, but as committed Christians and really seeking to integrate your Christian life and your vocation. So talk a little bit about that.
Sure. I grew up in the church, but I think it was unique for a number of reasons. First, my parents just became Christians around the time that I was born. Actually, when my mom wanted to get married in a church, and the pastor there said, only if he could do pre-marriage counseling with them. And the pre-marriage counseling didn't happen because every week my dad came with ways to debunk Christianity, and he just argued with the pastor every week. And with the arguing, him and his brothers are all like sort of health nuts. The one did Ironman triathlons for, 10, 15 years, something like that. And my dad, he's in his 60s and he will go out and swim for like an hour and a half. And for him, it's like, oh, I'm slow, I'm out of shape. I'm like, whatever. So with the pastor was like carrying a little extra weight. And the pastor kept saying, well, you need to read the Bible. And that said, well, I'll read the Bible if you commit to exercising and taking care of your body. And
I'll read the Bible every day if you run
yeah,
every day.
and the pastor, I don't think he followed through, but my dad did. And first time he read through the Bible 3 times, and I don't know if it was like a year and a half, something like that. And first time it was just to look for holes in it, ammunition. Second time he was like, there's something here. And then by the third time through, he was a Christian. And so growing up, it was not like you weren't allowed to ask questions. It wasn't like, well, this is just what we do. He would ask questions all the time and encouraged us to be curious. And he's very interested in truth, even if it was uncomfortable. So growing up, he instilled that in me. One, his faith was very alive, and it still is very alive. And he's taught us not to just give up if something didn't make sense, but to keep looking for different perspectives, to keep going. And then, I mean, they're both of them, both my parents, their lives are just, they're very humble, generous people. And so, yeah, that was definitely an advantage as well. That didn't mean that it was smooth sailing for me. It was definitely a crisis of faith for me when I was actually at a Christian college briefly in Manitoba. I only went there for a little while. And there's a lot, I don't want to get into too much of it, but essentially I remember thinking, like, if a lot of the things that they're saying, you know, if they're true, then none of this really makes any sense at all. And, you know, I'm not really buying it. And I can't believe that everyone just seems to be okay with it, like uncritically evaluating it. And I think I was probably not that fun to be around for a while, and that, you know, I'd get together with my friends and I'd be like, so, you know, the readings we had, like, what do you think about this? And, you know, what are the implications of it? And I think one time one of my friends just said, like, Eamon, we're tired of all these questions, and we just want to enjoy a sandwich at Tim Hortons. And I was like, okay, you know, back off. But that time was critical. And a lot of the ways that I think I got through that, there was a youth pastor when I was out in Alberta. I finished my high school out there, grade 11 and 12. And he's just a very, very thoughtful, loving guy who was only about 7 or 8 years older than me. And he just patiently listened to my questions. And some of the things he could answer, some of the things he really couldn't. But it provided me space to continue to work through questions. And I think time, in the sense that it was like, I feel like as long as he's listening and I have a dialogue partner, then I can keep wrestling this through. And you know, I still have questions, but going to seminary was a place where other questions were raised and some were answered, and a lot of them had to wait, you know, 4 or 5 years until we got down there to really be addressed. And then I think our time in Philadelphia, the church we were at for the 9 years we were there, I just got to see a lot of healthy relationships. It was really intergenerational, and a lot of very thoughtful Christians that were in our small group, in our church leadership. And so, you know, the formation practically, I think, from my parents, and that attitude of we're not afraid of the truth and we'll ask questions and wrestle things through, combined with really thoughtful people who were very patient and long suffering, and then getting to engage in ministry. I mean, I think probably when I was around 16, my dad would invite me to go to do prison ministry nearby in Kenora, and you know, that was really formative. That was powerful, and again, something where I couldn't say, well, you know, people are saying they believe these things, but they're not really following through with it. It was like, I'm going every couple of months out to Kenora with my dad and a group of other men from Dryden here, and we're visiting people in the prisons and involved with the food bank, and there's a life to the faith.
Yeah. How about you, Kathryn? I mean, your story is, I mean, I know a little bit more of your story than you shared here, and it's a very interesting story. You can get a lot of it from, you know, my conversation with your brother.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things about moving around so much and being involved in so many different ministries is you get to see the underbelly of everything, right?
Yeah.
So you get to see, you know, the pastors who are jerks, and you get to see the weak men who are pushing people around with their soft manipulation, and you get to see just sort of the seedy underbelly where it's like you present yourself one way and you aren't that way. And it's not just one guy, you know, it's an ongoing experience. So I think I was kind of black pilled kind of early on about just the reality that ministers are people. Like, they're just people.
Yeah.
And they have all the flaws and foibles that everybody else does. And my family's in ministry. And so I see my own family and I see myself and I'm like, well, we're the people doing it. So good night, you know.
Yeah. That's right.
So that's one element of the, like, okay, I've seen a lot and it doesn't always live up to the standard, which, I mean, obviously Christianity holds that within itself, because that's the whole idea, is that we're flawed and failed, and that we're here working and doing our best as flawed people to love God and serve people. But it was very true. Nobody's overplaying that card. And then also, the faith that my parents grew up in and that they taught us was probably a little more on the fundamentalist streak, a little more rigid about things like inspiration. How do we know what scripture says? So then when I got into my teen years, that became more of a challenge for me, because, you know, taking a class in university on world religions, going through scripture, they're talking about, you know, that was my first introduction to, oh, there's some editing that went on. How does that doesn't line up with what I was taught when I went to, you know, Sunday school or my parents. And so that was probably the first intellectual chink that I had. The other ones were more moral issues, being like, the morality here, it's not consistent. That was the first intellectual piece where I was like, well, that doesn't line up very well. Probably partly because I don't consider myself to be an overly intellectual person. When I was in high school, I wasn't reading philosophy, or, you know, I was like, I had an anarchist t-shirt that I used to wear all the time and I loved, but I didn't even know that it was an anarchist symbol. I just thought it was like a cool symbol. And then someone asked me why I was an anarchist, and I was like, I'm not an anarchist. I'm a communist. Why are you asking me that? So I was, you know, I was a 17-year-old girl, just like, I don't know. So I didn't have a lot of intellectual issues with it. I sort of took it at face value. I did run into more issues with it when I was newly married. I think I was 21. I started reading through Hebrews, and that was the first time I'd really studied Hebrews. And I got hung up a lot, because the way the author uses a lot of the Old Testament just felt like it was pulled out of context. And I didn't have an interpretive grid to have that make sense. It just felt like a manipulation of the text to create a new religion.
Yep.
And so that had me in a bit of a tailspin for probably a year. Mm-hmm. But I started the classes at Westminster, and I had some really good profs. Especially my biblical theology professors. And so they created a lot more room. I think one of the professors, I brought up the issue to him. He was like, well, if God inspired the original author, couldn't he inspire the editor? And I was like, that for me, thank you. So that like a few things like that, where I was able to bring some things, and professors who could answer it in a way that didn't feel manipulative and felt true to form, but also helped me to read scripture, because I'd never learned about biblical theology when in my household, right? It was systematic theology, and you learn the stories, but you got the stories and the systematics, and that was it. So that was helpful.
A very set way to interpret scripture, right? With the grammatical historical method. So you look at Hebrews, and that's not gonna fit. He's clearly not doing that.
But to the other side of your question, the like, well, you grow up in a ministry household, and you're sucked into the ministry piece of things. I've always had a little bit of mixed feelings about that, right? You get a little salty when you're like, well, my parents have time for all this, but then they're tired and they get home and they don't want to, it's not exactly an even street here. And I spend my evenings doing ministry, but I'm not in sports. I don't have music. This is what we do. We're all doing this thing. So I have had times where I was a little salty about it, But I've also had times where I look at that and I see the ways that it prepared me for other things.
Yeah.
So I think it prepared me to be a mother in ways I hadn't anticipated. I was a lot quicker on the boat of being able to be like, okay, this is what, you care for the other people, and
Yeah.
you put personal interest on the back seat because there's no time for it, because the babies have needs, and so
Yeah.
you care for the needs. And
Yeah.
Yeah, I think as I've gotten older, I've come to appreciate it more.
Okay.
But in my late teens, early 20s, it was a little harder. And there are things that if I was doing it, I would do it differently.
Mhm.
I think that's a hard one to navigate.
Mhm.
But I also, I think it's just hard to navigate when you decide to do full-time ministry. How are you going to handle that with your kids? Because you are taking on the care of a lot of people.
Yep.
And so how do you care for a lot of people and your own family at the same time?
Yeah.
It's hard.
Well, let's maybe shift over to trauma. Trauma has become, it's become a focus of a lot of attention. So my grandfather took a call to Owen Sound, Ontario, and actually that was the place that he spent his longest tenure in. I think he was there for 8 years. And my aunt had a lot who grew up there. My father never went to Owen Sound. He was just finishing up high school in Iowa. And so he did his last year of high school in Iowa at Pella Christian without my grandparents. He lived with someone else and then went to Calvin College. My grandfather and my aunt and my uncle and my grandmother all went up to Owen Sound. And Canada was a place in the Christian Reformed Church where a lot of Dutchmen emigrated from the Netherlands after the war. And obviously the German occupation was by no means easy in the Netherlands. There was starvation, there was brutality. And so a lot of people were impoverished by the occupation, and they went to Canada and California looking for a new life. And so Owen Sound and a lot of these Christian Reformed churches in Canada and California were sort of landing places. And then the Frisians and the Dutch came over and would come there, and sometimes they'd be sponsored by good, generous people. Sometimes they were sponsored by people who was seeing this as sort of a way to get a lot of cheap labor. And one of the things that probably would have helped the entire community at that point would have been some of the knowledge we now have pertaining to trauma. Because the stories I heard, my aunt in particular, who was then a teenage girl who did not like her time in Canada at all. And my grandmother did not like her time in Canada at all. And part of it was Canada, but a good part of it was the people who came over. I remember hearing stories about just how much fighting, how much conflict there was continually in the church between the people. Sometimes it was the Frisians and the Dutch, because they are two distinct groups and they had their own language. And the Frisians soon learned that my grandfather was fluent in both, which took them by surprise when they were talking about him behind his back in Frisian, and he just respond to them in perfect Frisian, and we can't play this game with you anymore. But looking back on it now, and I've had conversations with other Canadian CRC ministers with respect to this, because this is actually quite formative in the Christian Reformed Church in Canada, that the shape of the Christian Reformed Church in Canada, according Pete Van de Beek, he lives up in the Edmonton area. He claims, and I think he's got a good point, that a lot of this was simply the trauma from the war, which of course nobody had a category for. And then you not only have the trauma of the war, you have emigration trauma, where you're leaving your homeland, you come to a new place. So then you've got immigration trauma, because leaving is one thing and integrating is another. And you had, in many ways, I think probably 2 generations that were impacted by the trauma caused by the occupation of the Netherlands by Germany during the war. And today we would call that trauma. Then they didn't have a word for it. So and actually, Eamon, last conversation we had, you also mentioned developmental trauma, which got me thinking too. So talk about trauma in general first, and maybe give some examples of how trauma plays out, and then maybe we'll see where that goes. Either of you can jump in.
Sure. Well, so first, just a note about terminology. There's so many different terms and concepts that are thrown out there related to trauma, and they don't all overlap. Like PTSD, if you look in the DSM-5, it tends to be about safety of yourself physically, that either you or somebody that you know of, or something that you're witnessing, where somebody's life or bodily safety might be in danger. And it fits with often what happens in war. And it doesn't capture what can happen in abusive homes and upbringings, where if you're being emotionally abused, technically you wouldn't actually get a diagnosis of PTSD if you're going strictly by the letter of the law there in the DSM. Trauma is more sort of an umbrella category that encompasses PTSD as well, but I think gets at much deeper issues related to your sense of self, your own agency, and who you are. PTSD and trauma, broad categories. I think of it as instances that people experience either one time, if it's like a simple trauma, or multiple times in complex trauma or developmental trauma that make people more emotionally unstable, where there's issues with a sense of safety, a sense that you're experiencing the terrible things that have happened to you as if they're happening right now, even though they're not, because your body's been encoded with a fight or flight response or freeze response, the third one there, where something is happening where you see danger and you're reacting before you even know it. It's automatic. And I see that both with PTSD, specifically, but also with trauma. When you look at things like, I think I don't remember the exact stat, it's something like people who have personality disorders are 13 times more likely than the general population to have experienced developmental trauma. And it just makes sense, right? It shapes your sense of self and other people and how human relationships operate and work. It seems that with trauma, there is a certain portion of the population that, given enough time, they tend to recover from it. Actually, it's why with PTSD, there's a qualifier over time. I can't remember off the top of my head how many weeks it is, but a certain amount of time has to elapse, because you might have a reaction to something, but it will dissipate on its own. I think that people now are especially prone to it. And your point about immigration comes to mind, where we know one of the key factors for the development of a traumatic response is your perceived social support. Whether or not you have people around you who respond with compassion, with a listening ear, who believe you, versus those who don't. And that seems to be a major modulating factor for whether or not people experience terrible things and then carry it with them going forward or not. And there's other factors too. There's clearly a biological piece where some people are more prone to developing it just based upon their the way that they're made physiologically. But the social piece is huge, along with the coherency piece. A lot of the literature around trauma says that if one of the reasons people end up getting stuck, so the theory goes, in coming back to traumatic events, is that it's like their mind is trying to integrate that information into what they know about the world in a way that makes sense to them. And until that happens, they're going to keep looping back around to it, because there's this thing that is dangerous, that's threatening to them, that they can't make sense of. And I think in a time where we're struggling with coherency on a very large scale, you go the way that postmodernity, even though it does have some, I think, some good things with it, the way that it affects coherency, the way that deconstruction does that, to the way people view the world, has just made it even that much more difficult for people to make sense of what happens to them.
So that's a perspective sort of from psychology. What's the relationship between trauma and what's a more of a if you could talk about trauma in theological language, what kinds of things might you say? What is trauma theologically?
The state of the world.
Yeah.
I mean, theologically, trauma is when you face the darkness, right? The darkness has come at you. And a lot of scripture is about how do you face the darkness when it comes at you, and what is the darkness and where does the darkness come from. But trauma, because you can feel like you're ready to face the darkness and be like, I know who God is, I'm secure in my identity, I have this community, and then something happens that's so catastrophic that it ruins everything, right? Job is such a classic example, right? It's like his children are all killed, his livestock is wiped out, his health is gone. He's facing the darkness of everything he's built, except for his wife, baby, everything he's loved, collapsing.
We don't hear much about her after the curse gotta die thing.
No. You got a bunch more kids, but no guarantee it's from the same woman.
That's right.
So I think it's facing the darkness, because even when you're talking about trauma and PTSD, the DSM is a book that talks about the ways that people respond. It's all symptom based, it's all action based,
Descriptive. Yeah.
and so trauma can cause PTSD, but trauma isn't something that is easily categorized, because it's just when evil things happen, when things that you love are destroyed and are gone, when you experience yourself as being completely out of control, then it shocks your system and it hits you in the face and you're not ready for it. Now, some people get hit in the face and then they can bring in all the resources they have and they can address that experience. But some people don't have the resources to do that. Or it takes them a lot longer because it's a more integral blow. It's deeper. The other thing, scripture doesn't say, scripture isn't like a catalog, right? So it doesn't say it as cleanly, but there's a lot in scripture that highlights the embodied nature of trauma. You see David in the Psalms talking about, weeping on his bed and his bones aching. You have Elijah by the water, depressed, not able to move on. God sends care, but then he lets him rest. He says, eat and sleep. And so there is a real sense in scripture of an acknowledgement that it's not just a cognitive thing. It's your whole self, and it's in your body, it's in your flesh. And so if I had to categorize it theologically, that would be the constellation of language.
And it ends up, the most obvious, like, low-hanging fruit is that there's sin. It's the entrance of sin into the world, making it so that it's no longer intelligible, right? In terms of destroying what is beautiful and good and harmonious. There's many different flavors of sin. Some types you can kind of explain. You can break it down like, okay, yeah, you were really anxious, you were struggling, and so you were, drinking more, and over time, as you fed that, then you developed an addiction, and then everything that can come along with that. there's also an element of sin that is unintelligible, where it is the opposite of what is harmonious and logical. It's when you try to understand some forms of evil, it's impossible, because by its very nature, it is just pure chaos and the destruction of everything. And you see that also with Job and with others in scripture, where they're trying to make sense of something that is not intelligible, when when sin is that concentrated and that destructive, where you can't make sense of it. And then you're pressed on, well, then who is God? And there's this relational element, right, of, well, do I trust him? Is he who he says he is? And is the way that he says the world operates actually the way it operates? And I see people confronted with that regularly, that I see as clients, where they have a script for who God is and what it means to be a Christian, what to expect in it. If it doesn't include that, you are going to encounter some pretty awful stuff, and that there are people who are not just necessarily well-meaning and misunderstood you, but some that they are out to destroy, and that motivates them. And so, I mean, if you don't have categories for those things, you're going to be in trouble real quick with God, especially if you have a belief system where God is this sort of benevolent old grandpa who just gives you what you want, and whenever you come over, he gives you treats, and he would never ever let anything bad ever happen to you, because you're his little grandchild. And that's where I think theology in North America in particular sets people up for trauma. And it doesn't necessarily even have to be big things that happen to them. Just something that's painful and goes against what they've been told about who God is and what life is like.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about that setting up and the expectations, because the whole meme that was popular about a decade ago about first world problems, let's say, people by virtue of their upbringing, what they've been formed with, all the talk about privilege now sort of offsets first world problems. People who have had a tremendously comfortable life, and then something bad happens, and I when I graduated college, I was supposed to have a BMW, not a Chevy. What's Shalom has been violated.
Yeah.
But so that's one side of it. But then there's this other side of it where, part of this broken world has malformed people, because maybe they've been formed in a situation where, all sorts of things that many of us would say, that's just evil. Children should not be subject to that. Either seeing that or having that been done to them. Family structure should be more like this and not like that. There's part of our culture and sort of a facile relativity. Well, people can do anything, and all that's fine, but you very quickly realize, no, there are certain shapes and forms that actually lead to what almost all of us would regard as better outcomes than those who have an inability to trust, difficulty in maintaining stable relationships, difficulty, let's say, growing up and being able to become parents who can, continue on the life cycle intergenerationally. I want you to explore that a little bit for me, because I think that's there are a number of things that are coming at us right now in this time with respect to that. There's sort of this argument that, there's no structure to creation at all. And all of this, it's all social constructivism or what have you. But I dare bet both of you have some ideas about this.
Well, it feels like there's at least two audiences to that topic, right? There's the people within the church who have been set up by a vision of the Christian life, Christian identity, and the nature of God that sets them up for a fall. And then there's what might be the other side of the broader culture. Obviously, there's a lot of overlap, but the other side of it being more what you were laying out there, which is there isn't a principle, there isn't a God to violate, through trauma or whatever. There's just total chaos. And the society is pushing towards more chaos. We want to dissolve more boundaries. We want to create more options, which means less clarity. And so I think just to set up to answer the question, you have at least two major ways that people are being set up to fail.
And they're both germane, because the church is almost always dealing with both of them, and that's difficult for people in the church, because and often it's the case where people who are coming out of tremendously traumatic upbringing come to the church where there's order and pattern and structure and stable categories, and they're like, oh, I can be safe here, I can rest here. And then you've got people that have been formed in a fairly structured context, and then other things come in and they say, hey, wait a minute, this is not per my expectation. And I think that leads to some of what you talked about, Eamon, in terms of, hey, God, I'm a Christian, bad things aren't supposed to happen to me.
Yeah. On the side of being set up for it, it's funny, I have a few clients who know a bit what I do in terms of working up north. Like a good portion of my work involves flying up to communities that don't even have road access. They're very isolated, a lot of poverty, issues with housing, because some of them were not constructed very well, and you have mold. It's a mess. High addiction rates. I think one of the communities, the last number I had heard was something like 70% of the adults were participating in some sort of opioid replacement therapy, to give you some idea of chaos. And I have one client in particular who, back years ago, he would say, like, well, I know some of the work that you do, and I feel bad even saying that I've had a bad week, and he would just sort of minimize everything. And I get that if the way that you work, the way you approach the world is to try to quantify everything, then I guess that makes sense as a way to approach things. But that just doesn't work. It doesn't work. And it's a way of, I think, beating other people down and shaming them. I meet people where you could look at their life and say, everything is actually pretty good, but they have crippling depression that's probably based more in their biology than anything. And what's their struggle there? Well, their struggle is to make sense of what's going on. Why, when everything in my life seems all right, am I so miserable? And somebody who's taking that approach of trying to quantify suffering, they'll say, well, you look at this person who they were abused by their parents and they were in and out of the foster care system. Like, you don't even have a right to say that things are difficult. And I do think that understanding trauma as struggling to make sense of the way that you experience life and the way that you understand life is a helpful way of not playing that game of, well, who's suffered more. It puts you in a place of, I think, rightly being humble and being like, I don't know the depths that person's depression. I mean, you read some poetry of people who go through depression, and I mean, when you hear it, they're describing hell right inside of them. And if you don't have compassion for that, I don't know entirely what to say, but that there is a subjective element to it, and that trauma it's although you can bring in quantitative measures for how somebody's affected, that doesn't capture. There's a qualitative element to it that keeps us from that comparison game, which is why I think you can see similar phenomenon from somebody who grew up in a horrible neighborhood and went through all sorts of things that are just horrendous, you don't even want to speak of, and people who grew up middle upper class, who were in a decent church with fairly loving people around them, who are experiencing trauma because they can't make sense of the world. They can't put it together, and now they're in a meaning crisis. I think there's a reason why Vervaeke's work has just been so helpful, and that's what he's touching on, I think, around this question of trauma. Hopefully I'm getting at what your question is, Paul.
So I think part of the frame of psychology that I think we're struggling with is you have an individual, and again, there might be a biological disposition to depression. There might be something they need to see their primary care physician about, et cetera, et cetera. But an individual is always, in many ways, also deeply integrated with their community. They're deeply integrated with their history. And trauma, it seems to me, is we have a, so let's say, so Kathryn drew a nice line there. Let's say you had, I had very healthy parents. We did not have trauma in the home. We certainly lived in a ministry context where there were a lot of people who had suffered significant trauma, but by virtue of how my parents raised me and the way things were structured, I think that was all done in a fairly healthy way, so that we could sort of, we didn't use the word trauma, but we could sort of have a sense of, this is the way the world should be. This is not the way the world should be. If even though, certainly my parents nor my home were perfect, it was good enough, especially in comparison to all of this violation of shalom. And I think part of the struggle we're dealing with now, especially in a context where there's a public agenda of social constructivism that wants to say reality is a white sheet of paper. Mm-hmm. And we can, hey, it's time to, we're gonna have a great reset now, COVID, now that we have the new powers we have, given, at least y'all in Canada, especially. In the US, we we had the pesky First Amendment, but we can sort of, we can create people to thrive by just remaking the categories. And it seems to me that for many people, to a degree, I don't want to push this too far, trauma is a violation of the categories, either that's been done to us, or that we've done, or that we've borne witness to. But there's a degree to which that is constructed. In other words, if you grew up in a very orderly home, I remember talking to someone who was again raised in a household in which parents, when parents disagreed, they didn't have some big flat out fight in front of their children. They would talk about their disagreements privately. Children did not grow up listening to their parents argue. They certainly never saw their parents hit each other. They didn't see things thrown, plates breaking. That wasn't what it was. And then suddenly that comes in, and some say, no, that's not how parents should argue. Well, who are you to say how parents should argue? Where are those lines? And it seems that, especially when, Eamon, when you and I spoke in another conversation about developmental trauma, it seems that developmental trauma for some it's a recoding. But once you suggest that all systems are not the same, you are, in a sense, making an implicit argument that there are, in fact, categories to reality, and that certain categories produce, especially intergenerationally, better outcomes, and others worse outcomes. And when you for example, whether you're doing ministry in urban areas, or if you're working with very isolated communities like you've mentioned, Eamon, you often get the sense of, hey, wait a minute, this is normal for this community, and I'm not sure this is serving them, and that's a tell on, let's say, a created order. And I think part of, say, the Jordan Peterson movement has been, I think fundamentally what Peterson did for people is suggest, some people want to use the word natural law, that there is actually a structure to reality, and that structure has been to a degree known by us. It's been actually encoded in a variety of texts in many different ways, and that if we pay a little bit of attention to that, we might be able to bless some people and not curse them, and in fact construct communities. Because I said, oh, social constructivism. No, we are called to construct communities. We're called to construct households, but that's kind of where I'd like to see us get into this question of trauma. What does trauma tell us about the created order?
I'm not going to answer that question yet.
Okay.
I want to pivot just a little bit.
Yep.
Because I think that, to go to your other question, which was, how do these environments set you up for a fall, right? I think that that's a little different than how trauma is working itself out. It's how does it set you up for a fall? And I think in those two communities, it's different, the way I split. And they're both pivot on identity. So like you were just saying, let's just say not closed Christian community group. I'm going to make that my left-hand side for now. That group, the problem is that you're told you make your own identity, which is an impossibility. It runs against everything you know. Who you are is a person who functions in relationship to other people all of the time. And even when you're alone, you know that you're alone because you're not with other people. It's always defined by your role within the society, the relationships that you have in the society, who you care for, in what ways you care for them, and what you're building. You can't have an identity in isolation. And never mind in isolation from other people. Currently, our culture is trying to say you can have an identity in isolation from your own body. So we're going to divide even further. It's first, well, you don't have to be connected to your culture. Then you don't have to be connected to your local community. Then you don't have to be connected to the family you're born into. And now it's, you don't have to be connected to the body that you're in. How on earth is any person, never mind a child, supposed to create an identity out of that? You can't. So what it does is create massive anxiety, massive depression, because if you don't have an identity, then it's not just who am I? It's where am I going? What am I doing? What is my purpose? And if you can't be heading towards something that you think is valuable and actively achieving things that bring you further down that path, you will not be happy. There won't be any satisfaction. There won't be any meaning. Nihilism is the only place you can go to without a clear identity. And every culture has always had some kind of a structure and a norm and a system and a society which told you who you were, what you were doing, where you're going, and how to do that well, and who was doing it poorly. And there were consequences for people who did it poorly, because everybody knew that if you do it poorly, everything gets worse and nobody's happy about it. So we all work together to kind of shuffle you into line and say, let's do the good thing together so we can all have happy, meaningful, fulfilling lives. And our society has just decided to chuck the whole bag and say, we're going to go for uber Gnosticism. We are going to divorce our identity from everything else. And we're going to start with the youngest people, because they do start more blank. They do start, it's not a total blank slate, but they're much more impressionable. They're not a mother yet. They're not a father yet. They're not a, artist. They're just little. So you can tell them, okay, now make up your mind. What are you? What are we doing?
I don't know if you've ever raised a child. It's like, you're really going to do this to children? Have you met a child?
Yes. So I think fundamentally the way that we're going crazy in the non-closed communities is we're giving more and more autonomy, thinking if you have more autonomy, then you will have more control, then you will be happier because you have more control. But autonomy is never purely free floating like that. You need a central pivot point. You still need a place that you're headed, or a central node, like Peugeot likes to talk about. You need a center to the system. Otherwise, even your rebellion isn't rebellion. Nothing has any coherence because you have no orienting points. So I lost my train of thought, but that's my thought.
That was good. That was good. I like that. That might make the, now when I'm doing these conversations, I'm thinking, ooh, what am I going to use for the teaser? So that's a candidate for the teaser. That was good.
Oh, that'd be good. I do have a blurb on the other side of things. So on the Christian side, or I think probably other closed communities too.
So you're using open and closed communities. What do you mean by that?
Well, I'm trying to say communities that, like Christian communities that have a clear identity with a pivot point established.
Okay.
And then you have the rest of society that's trying to do away with a central point. And I'm trying to make it more inclusive because I think that this involves more than just Christian households, churches. I think it's other communities that have a similar structure. So I don't know if open and closed communities is the best.
I think that's pretty good. It's a place to start.
It's somewhere to start. But I think they're in the communities I've been involved in the churches I've been involved in, where it's gone wrong for people who I see are set up for failure. It tends to be, again, an issue with identity. It's like, join our group. There's this big push for like, oh, become a born again Christian. Join our group, say that you're following Jesus. And now what? Now what do you do? Well, you're a Christian until you go to heaven. That's great. You're a Christian now. Hey. And he's like, well, what do you do? I don't know. What am I supposed to do? And you have some people where it's like, oh, well, I've been called to the ministry. And so I have this special calling and now I have a purpose. So you get like this elite class of people.
And no one can question it.
And no one can question it because God told me. We have the elite who get to have like a purpose and a mission. And you do have churches that call everybody to, oh, everybody should come and do ministry. We should all do this together, which I'm a big fan of. But even there, it's not enough to really get a good grip on the identity. So what it ends up defaulting to tends to be older cultural traditional values. So hierarchical family structures, hierarchical church structures, none of which is necessarily negative, but that is somewhat divorced from scripture and how it often plays itself out, especially in individual family structures, individual church structures. It can be a little, what's the word I'm looking for? When it's just particular to one community.
Idiosyncratic.
Idiosyncratic, yeah. But you don't get as much of, at least in my experience, there's not a whole lot of teaching on what do you do now that you're a Christian? What is your identity? Who are you in Christ? And not just like, oh, I'm loved and I'm special and God has good things for me, but what are you actually meant to functionally do? What does it mean that you are here as the ambassador of God and you have a purpose to fulfill? And how do you actually do that? Instead of just saying, go do it, it's like, well, what are you supposed to think to do it? And how do you perform that function? So you have a clear identity that you can functionally pursue no matter what part of your life stage you're in or what part of society you're in. I think, again, it's identities that instead of on the one side, we said, there's nothing there. On the other side, we said, there's something here, but it's very rigid and it's very hard to know how to make it actionable.
Well, and I would add that you have a bit of the modernity in there as well with the Protestant Reformation, where it's, well, and how do we decide whether you're in our group or not? Well, it's a set of propositions and whether or not you believe them. And if you believe them, then you're with us, you're Baptist, Methodist, whatever. And if you don't, well, then maybe you're a Catholic, maybe you're something, but you're not part of our community. And so it's not safe to even ask the question, because asking the question might mean being, expulsion from your group, which is going to be traumatic. And then, well, now if I'm not what I always thought I was, well, then who am I? And then, how safe do I feel to, and then, well, what's the pressure being built there? Well, then it's to join that other side where, well, it's just whatever I make it to be, because it's too propositional, too narrowly defined, and there's not room to explore. It's rigid. So you have a lot of people being pushed out into that other group because of that. I think it's a cross pressure that's real.
And there's some groups that have a performative element, right? Like there's some groups where it's like, well, if you're not speaking in tongues and slain in the spirit, then you maybe have some things you need to work on. as a believer in this community. And so then those people who feel like they can't perform on that level because they're not exhibiting whatever, they end up then feeling pushed out of that community. Or you have communities where to be an esteemed member of the community, it's like, well, you need to be a mom whose home looks like a magazine, and you need to have, you need to be the dad who is making this much money and never has any emotional output. There's certain performative elements, and if you don't perform, there's a lot of shame in the community. And so then you get driven.
And while all of these things are happening on just that one plane of existence, life's still happening. So you get news that your mom is going to be dead of cancer in 6 months, or that your brother was in a car accident, or that your child has developmental delays, or whatever. So now you have that real life mixed in with these thoughts. Not that our theology isn't real life, you know what I mean, that more abstract, and we're meaning making is an ongoing process, right? So you're always trying to integrate information. It's like, hey, this fits here, this fits there, this doesn't fit, where do I put it? And now I don't have a community, and I've encountered just life with its many disruptions and pains and suffering.
I think part of the difficulty that I've seen in Christian communities is that you're right, in especially a confessional Protestant context, you have a very, especially in something like the Christian Reformed Church, this is diminished considerably in the last 50 years, but that confessional level was supposed to be determinative pretty deeply into the stack. And I think part of what's happened, and that certainly is true, let's say to a fairly closed community, let's say like the Amish, where this is something, I think, as you well said, Kat. I mean, so if you're Amish, you know a lot about yourself. You're, no zippers, hooks, cart, not a car, maybe a phone in the barn for emergencies, so being Amish, a lot about yourself. What's happened in a lot of other communities is that, okay, so we're Christian. So now we're going to have conversations about, well, what does that entail with respect to all sorts of aspects of my life, my economic life, my family life, my, where we come down on sexual issues, et cetera, et cetera. And I think to a certain degree in society, when it was quite a bit homogeneous with respect to these issues, it was a lot easier on churches where, infant baptism or believer baptism, you can kind of pick, but the rest of it, you're going to drive a Buick and you're going to make this and you're going to have a pension and all of this stuff, everything, the rest of the stack sort of stays the same. And a lot of this is happening. And I think part of where the trauma conversation comes in now is that once in a sense, well, now we understand trauma. Oh, now we understand trauma. This is a big deal. And now we can sort of look back in the past and say, maybe we should both be a little bit more generous towards people in the past who weren't particularly nice to each other because they had suffered trauma, and trauma can explain some of that. Once you establish that very powerful tool, however, now you're on the side of a church and someone says, hey, you've not only, I expect my identity to be affirmed and not only affirmed, but celebrated. And if my identity that I have chosen up from my secret sacred self, perhaps, for whatever source, I'm not going to explore that too much, but this thing that I've chosen is not only affirmed, but celebrated, I call that abuse, and therefore hence trauma. And now this religion that you have is very much a toxic community because by virtue of its confessional aspects and anything else that comes into the stack, well, that's abusive and therefore traumatic and therefore must in fact be destroyed. And and we've seen sort of the weaponization of this liturgy develop fairly quickly and then taken on either social capital and social power, or in some cases even governmental power.
Mm-hmm. Well, you think of it, the different reactions. There's definitely a fight element when you feel threatened, whether it's based in reality or not. And so the people who tend more towards that, that is going to play itself out. On one level is like I think it's somewhat legitimate, traumatic response to things. But it's not going far enough in understanding, what does healing from this actually mean? I think I had a conversation about a year ago with a client who's gone just through horrible things. I'd been sexually abused by several different people. They didn't know one another, just living in sort of a dangerous area where these things sadly are very common. And one of the things I really appreciated about this client is she's just very, very honest about everything, really. And she was aware of some of the darkness inside of herself too, and some of the things that she had done and the way she had responded. And she ended up having to work kind of close by somebody who had done some things to her. And her response, and it brought me to tears. I get a little choked up even thinking about it. Is she said, "Well, I know what this person did to me, but I know some of the people in this person's life as well, and some of the things they did to them, and I don't necessarily trust this person, but I'm not angry at them, and I can see why they did what they did. Not that it was okay at all, but I see it, and I don't want to keep that going, that pattern going." And I thought, this person is not a Christian, but they understand something deeper about trauma and how it transforms us and makes us potentially perpetrators, if we're not careful. And that's a piece that's missing from a lot of what's said about trauma. Is it's just, well, you've had this done to you, and we're just going to protect you. And I think of developmental trauma. I think the first time I really came in contact with somebody like that wasn't a patient or a client. It was actually very early on in my training, and this other student asked me, I think it was like a month in to our placement, and she just said, so like, how's it been going for you with clients? And I said, I think it's been going okay. I was not totally new to it, so I'd done a year placement when I was at Westminster, actually. But I'm just trying to be open, like, oh, so like, you seem like kind of surprised, like, how come? And her response to me, she said, well, I'm really surprised that it's going okay for you, because you seem really nice. And I'm like thinking, what? This is really, like, it didn't compute. But I got to know her more. And as I got to know her story, it was like, oh, people who are nice, they want something from you. They're setting you up to use you in some way. And a couple years into my time at Widener, I found it's like, oh, this person has conflicts with everybody, and had completely isolated herself from not only her classmates, but every professor there, and any supervisor she had at any site. And she was operating out of, well, I'm going to protect myself, and if you seem like you're I'm going to attack you, I'm going to question you, undermine you. And on the one level, I thought it's understandable given what she's gone through. Now, what is she doing? She's a destructive force in like every community that she's a part of. Yeah. And so, yeah, it has to go deeper.
Yeah. And you to get back to, I like, Kathryn, how you sort of laid out, kind of a two communities. You find people like that in the church, and you find people like that who have, it's funny because churches are amazing organisms. They can sort of adapt to someone like that. And on one hand, the church sort of contains them, because if they do something too outrageous, well, then suddenly this tradition that the church is built on, well, now they've clearly stepped out of a line, so they're going to be dealt with or pushed out or something. But so it kind of contains them and doesn't let them get too crazy. But you do go into churches sometimes and you find people with these personality disorders that are just kind of, wreaking tiny havocs in the church. And then someone comes in and it's like, these are the people of God, and this just keeps happening, and nobody says, hey, wait a minute. I mean, you talked about that, Kathryn, a little bit with, what you saw, ministry after ministry. I mean, churches are, if you're a psychopath or a con man, churches religion is like the easiest con around. It really is.
Mm-hmm.
I have a great uncle. I'll tell you about him briefly. He's called Tricky Dick because he was a con man, and he would go across Canada and get churches to build him houses, and then he sold them and then would move on to the next church. After he'd get the parsonage built, he'd sell it, pocket the money, go to the next church. So it's very true that like narcissists are drawn like, bees to honey. Churches are somewhat vulnerable because they have a more optimistic view. Even though there's a lot of churches that believe in things like total depravity, they still have a fairly optimistic view, and they trust people in authority. Yeah. So if you come in and say this institution, I graduated, I have this degree, I worked at these churches, they say, okay, minister, what do you need? Oh, you need a house. Oh, okay. It's like, it's very true that churches are, you get some of the best and the worst.
Yeah, you really
in churches where there can be a naivety about things, like the stories that I've heard numerous times that break my heart are the ones where, there's often sexual abuse that has gone on. Somebody who's maybe somewhat prominent in the church. It's, 16, 17-year-old girl. And then when things are brought to light, the church leadership, because they don't know what's going on. They don't know how to categorize these things. Weirdly, they'll talk about sin, but when they're confronted with it, it's like it blows their circuits. And they'll say, well, he says that he's sorry and asking for forgiveness, and why haven't you forgiven him? You need to forgive him and move on. And it's this flat understanding of forgiveness and reconciliation, and then it just perpetuates itself. And churches where they're distrustful of government, of child and family services, and so they don't want those things to get out, and so they become places where this can happen. And it's just so complicated. It's not easy to just say, oh well, this is why this happened, or goes about why this happened, but it's a piece of too many people's trauma stories. And I think it's good that the church is becoming more aware of it as a category. Well, I also see the dangers of uncritically examining these things and just going with a completely psychologized view of it.
Yeah. One part of what makes the church such an easy con is so often in communities where you just have to adopt a certain language. The Bible is the inerrant word of God. Well, he said the Bible is the inerrant word of God. You have your testimony, you have your language. If you can get all that language dialed in, you can go a long ways with a community that feels embattled. And it's like, not enough people are around saying these words. And so if you say those words, he said those words, he's in.
He's one of the good ones. Yeah.
Well, and it seems to me the relationship between the church and psychology, has been an interesting one. And this has changed quite a bit, even in my lifetime, where I think 50 years ago, there was quite a bit more skepticism with respect to Christians and psychology. A lot of that changed actually because of the neo-evangelicals, Carl F. Henry, Billy Graham. Molly Worthen in her book, The Apostles of Reason, really nicely lays out basically how this crew said, oh, actually, we should use psychology to further evangelism and the gospel. And then Larry Crabb, maybe 15, 20 years ago, really came on the scene in terms of evangelical psychology and wrote quite a few books. Cloud and Townsend, Boundaries. I mean, so there's been a lot. You've got some churches, mega churches, usually they'll have their own even in-house department. And then you've got also the so one church that is now leaving my denomination came to class this one day with a big presentation about their biblical counseling department. And their biblical counseling was all, here's the framework of the Bible. We're not going to use Freud or Jung or any of those dangerous people out there. We're just going to use what we find in the Bible, and that's going to be our counseling department. So it seems we're continuing along an evolutionary trail with respect to understanding Christianity and psychology. One of my conversation with Sevilla King early on, she talked about the fact that she was a secular therapist, but then doing some of her training, working in faith communities, began to realize, oh, wait a minute, faith communities have for a very long time done things to actually help the psychological well-being of their members before we had those categories. And someone could look to, let's say, Augustine's Confession as a deeply psychological book.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the dude is looking at himself very carefully in that book. So I wonder if you two have thoughts on this, especially given your experience with this, because I continue to see where there's a lot of unfinished work in this, especially with respect to psychology. Is not just about the individual and sort of if I have a broken arm, now maybe a smart doctor would say, well, maybe you need to fix the stairs that caused you to fall down and break your arm.
Yeah.
But, we are, especially Kathryn, I loved your little piece on identity there, because you don't have an identity outside of the context in which that identity, the only way, the agent arena relationship, it's the arena that gives the identity sense, and vice versa. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. I'm sure you both have lots of thoughts.
Yeah. Like, oh, we could talk about that for 3 days. That's
well, especially because both of you, I'll often talk to, I'll talk to, let's say, psychological professionals who have very little experience in the church. And so their view of the church is very low resolution. People who are deeply within the church, but don't really have much in terms of the psychological credentials. And what strikes me is you two both have a lot of experience in the church, education in both of these realms, but also a lot of applied experience as well.
A couple of quick thoughts. One, historically, how some of this happened. I think back to Dr. Dobson and Dr. Spock, right? With Spock, with the permissive parenting, and then there's arguments about, how much his message was maybe distorted. Parents did not feel empowered and things were not good. And along comes Dr. Dobson, who has a psychology background, and he gave parents a sense of agency. And what gave him credit was that setting boundaries for kids and expectations, and but also being gentle with them and making sure there's a caring home. It worked, and so the church got on board. I see it on the other side. I'll never forget my adult psychopathology class. It was interesting. I got to know the prof a bit, and he shared that his dad had been planning to be a minister, and then decided not to be a minister, became a psychologist, and then he had just thrown all of his faith away, and so had this prof, his son, and he's involved in a lot in Philadelphia and creating policy and trying to look beyond the individual. And he said in class one time, somebody asked him, so, well, what do you think the future is of psychology and helping people? Because we know that, well, there's value in one-to-one, people need a community. And he said, well, I was thinking that probably the best way for this to be organized would be, not so much that you have one therapist who's giving people therapy, or even necessarily even leading a group, but if you have the group sort of helping one another, and maybe you have one person who's kind of guiding things and is making sure that people stay in line. And I'm just thinking, like, he's describing what the church is supposed to be.
You have smaller groups.
Yeah, you have smaller groups that help one another and like minister to one another. And eventually people grow and you see people at different places.
And then they'll need a building, and then they need a symbol on the building to help people recognize it. Orient them in space and time.
If they had songs, they could sing together.
Singing, that would be great if we had singing.
And so
maybe a ceremony, maybe a little meal or something. That might work.
Yeah. I think that would work. It would go a long way.
And so this divorce, right, in how we view the world, with the church be doubling down in some corners on the theology, Bible, the way that church is, and then this other side that's looking to see, well, how can we understand how these things operate in the world? I hope that there's more of a coming together, because when it comes down to it, people are going to ask, does it work? Does this actually work out in reality or not? And in your point about identity, it's like it doesn't work. Anyways, that was a bit of an aside, but it's interesting seeing these currents on both sides.
Well, that's the story I was thinking about when he was talking. I wanted to say the other piece of this is that while there's a lot of trauma that takes place in the church is also the central node for healing. One of the books that's been running circles around our little corner of the internet has been The Ethics of Beauty, which I've gotten a little ways into. We have, and that's one view of how to address trauma, and it's a very communal view. It's he might say a lot more later in the book, but at least early on, he's talking about narrative and joining into narratives together, and how joining into those narratives together allows you to address the trauma in a way where you're with a group, you're in a community, you're able to look at the difficult thing, even with the thing within yourself, right? Because a lot of war trauma, it's the things you did. So you're looking at the ugliness, but because you're in this community, that means there's this implicit acceptance. And so, because often one of the things that makes trauma so sticky is the shame that goes with it, right? If you're a perpetrator, or if you've been harmed in a way that it isn't, I was going to say it isn't interpersonal, but even that, because if you've been harmed, you weren't able to protect yourself. And so there's this deep fundamental feeling of loss of control, loss of agency. And for a lot of people, that's really shameful, because it shows that they're weak. They weren't capable. They couldn't do what they wanted to. They couldn't protect themselves, whether that's from humans or the elements, either way. But one of the things, when you can look at things like that, traumatic things that have happened, choices that you've made in a group, the fact that you're in that group and you're all looking at it together. You were preaching recently about the bronze serpent. It's that same idea. You're together, you're looking at the evil together. Just the fact that you're doing that communally starts to address the shame, because shame is a social emotion. Shame is feeling that the group will push you out. And so when you have an experience of the group being together, the group owning it together, which I think, the thread of, we confess the sins of our nation, we confess the sins of our church, we communally take ownership for that. That's a direct arrow into the issue of shame, because if we can communally do that, it helps the people in the community who have things that are on their mind that they've done that are shameful, but it also helps you because you're seeing it, you're owning it as a community in some way. By taking on more of that burden, you also somehow alleviate your own, because you identify with the group while you do that.
And
so it pulls it.
Fear too, because now it's not just you up against whatever this evil is. There's other people who are saying they recognize it as well. And you hear the people that are traumatized, they'll often say they feel like everyone seems like they're crazy, that they see something and people say it's not there. And so when there is that recognition of evil, it's the shame. It's also like, okay, I don't have to draw people's attention to this as much, because we're all looking at it together, and you see it as wrong, and you're calling evil. as opposed to calling it good or just pretending it's not there.
It seems, there's always a conversation between the institutional church and the organism and the institution. My view is you often need the institution in order to facilitate the organism. So, sort of like you need a spine in order to have a body. A crab needs a shell in order to actually function. But I really like the deep facilitation that if the rupture in shalom, there's going to need a communal healing. It's going to have to be a dance between people in how those traumas are healed. Obviously there's going to be work that individuals are probably going to have to do in terms of they're going to have to rewrite some narratives. They're going to have to probably confront some things in themselves and look at some new ways of interacting with other people. But yeah, to actually be able to have a healthier relational dance between people, and to have that practiced, and to have it done within a far broader narratives of healing. I mean, forgiveness obviously is one of the big things that some of the current narratives in our culture just simply don't provide. Well, these are historical wrongs, and these historical wrongs need to be pointed out. Okay, what's next? What are you going to do to the heirs of these historical wrongs and all the different levels of manifestation that these things have wrought? What do you do with that? Did you try to wipe them out? Well, we've seen a lot of trying to wipe things out. It's very hard to erase things in human history. So, and I think, I've seen in, not so much anymore, but about a generation ago, getting into counseling was sort of what preachers who were burned out on church work did. And I think part of that was because they did their preaching, they did their pastoral care, they maintained the institution, and they saw a whole bunch of people with all of these things in the church that just, went on and on and on at that. Well, my preaching and my advice and my Christian, none of that affected. Maybe if I became a psychologist and a counselor, then I could get him in the box and really change him. And then then I see counselors who are just sometimes rolling, throwing up their hands and rolling. I can't change these people. I have them an hour a week, but then they go back home and, undo everything we've tried to do. And so you really need much more of a situation that people are there's going to need a communal element of this. It's going to have to be liturgical. It's going to have to be narrative. It's going to have to be symbolic. It's going to have to be flexible, enduring, and a little bit anti-fragile. And so, I see that as, for me as a pastor and someone who is very interested in helping communities form. Yeah, this is, I'm not looking to get out of my job. I think it's integral, but I'm also not looking to divorce the counselors, because there are some people in my church who are like, you should really see someone, but not in, Larry Crabb was complaining that, preachers find a problem and, call in the Christian counselor and they'll fix them. It's like, none of it's that easy.
Well, and the other thing is, you're saying your list of what you want in the church, and you also want a group where somebody can participate. They don't come as a consumer. They don't show up and go through the programming.
Right.
They show up and, they're told, well, now you're a greeter. You're going to say hi to everybody who walks through the door. Oh, you're here. Great. Come, let's get coffee ready. Like you're in as an active member, which again, immediately it brings you into agency. It brings you into a sense of value and meaning, because if you go back to identity is who you are in relationship to other people. If you don't have a role in relationship to other people where you help and you serve and you care, there's something, there's a few people who are crazy, but I think for almost everybody, if you don't have that, you just feel
there's
useless.
A few people who are really crazy, but everyone's a little crazy.
Yes. Yes. But if you don't have a role where you're serving and you just receive,
yep.
You end up feeling disgusted with yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And then you feel shame. And then you alienate yourself from yourself. And then you usually lash out on other people and get controlling and get rigid, right? So having a whole culture, even within church culture, that's a consumer culture, it's antithetical to the actual call of Christ. And so how could that not be destroying? So I liked your list, but I wanted to throw another little.
No, that's good. That's good. And it's as a pastor, you know it. If someone doesn't have a job in the church, they're not in the church. And they might not, example, Rick, I'm still trying to get Rick baptized, but but Rick has a job in the church. Rick is in some ways more a part of this church than other people who've been members for a long time, because I'll tell you, if Rick's not here on Sunday, he ain't gonna get the live stream, baby.
That communal element, this is the stories I hear from people so often that have healed. Or you have one individual in particular where he grew up, his parents were alcoholics, and he was taken away from them for a few years and then put back with them, but he probably really shouldn't have been. And he made friends with a pastor's son at school, and became a Christian. And he said basically the last 2 years of high school, he more or less just lived there. Yeah. And that's how he learned how to be like what a family was like, how a husband should treat his wife, and parents their child. And it was transformative. And sadly, over the last 2 years, I don't know how many people I've thought when they're get referred to me like, you need friends, like, and it's been brutal being like, I can't direct them to connect necessarily, depending on where you live, right? Depending on the lockdowns. And not to get into that as a political thing, but just practically, like, people need connection. They don't have that. It's brutal. It's cruel to tell them, just do these things and you'll be better. And the reason, which is implying the reason that you feel miserable is because you're not doing breathing techniques, or you're not thinking the right thoughts, or whatever the different interventions that are there from psychology. It doesn't encompass enough. And to move a little bit back to the ethics of beauty, I'm looking forward to finishing it. So from what I've seen so far, I'm thinking of those two different audiences that you've mentioned, Kathryn, where there is a group where I think, yes, that the participating, the seeing the beauty, all of that is integral to their healing. There's another group where I'm not quick to be down on a truth first approach sometimes. Not that you have to divorce them, but I know people where they call evil good and good evil, or the words that are being used have different connotations. Like you talk to somebody who's been in a coercive, abusive relationship, and what's the emotional valence for a word like love? Oh, or trust, and it's good to show them, of course, what healthy relationships mean. I'm not saying that you don't do that, but clarifying these things really does matter. It's why I still think the pulpit really matters, and being able to speak truth and name things for what they are is helpful to orient people who are otherwise completely disoriented. Yeah. And then moving into the community piece where you're interconnected, and you see things like beauty and togetherness and participation. And I'm assuming it's going to end really well, the book, because it's been so good so far. But it's been in the back of my mind thinking I hope people don't overcorrect on this, because I'm working through definitions with people often. Yeah.
And often a lot of this is the context in which you're working. I mean, contexts vary greatly, and there are contexts in which the certain approach to truth has been just so hammered down that people just need to breathe a little bit. And then there are other situations where there's just no truth to be found, and yeah, you could use some structure. One of the things that I've noted in ministry, so I'm when I look at the kinds of preachers that are in storefront sometimes Hispanic, sometimes African-American churches who are sort of rescuing former gangbangers and such. What you just described is so common. They go into the prisons and it's like, you sit down with that kid and say, hey, look, this is the way this thing's going to go. If you hitch a ride with me now and we get some probation, you're going to come and live with my house. You're going to live by my rules. And I'm going to pretty doggedly hold you to them. And I'm going to teach you a new way to live. And if you succeed at that, and that often works. Not everybody makes that cut, but that often works because they grew up in so much chaos that they just need, and it's some of the reasons sometimes people join the army and it really helps turn them around because there's structure. And okay, you've got structure now. Now you can begin to do something. And other churches like, mine tends to attract more people who've had a semblance of structure already in their lives. And now we'll be a little bit less assertive and we won't lock things down. I'll give you quite a bit of rope to hang yourself. And hopefully at the end, I'll say, no, that's kind of pinching on your neck, isn't it? Maybe that wasn't the best way to go about your life. Let's try something else. So
I see that in addictions all the time. Worked a bit with a ministry teen challenge, and the stories that I hear are often exactly what you described. It's all this chaos, and then there's order brought in, and in the outcome rates for some of them, some of the locations for teen challenge are like way higher than what you get from your typical treatment center. And that structure and meaning is just it's crucial. And in this other dynamic too that I see where and I have a lot of sympathy for both groups. The group that's like, I need to get out of these rules and everything at church, and it's because it's been done in a way that's been heavy-handed or lacking love. It's just follow the rules. And then I have this contingent of clients where all of them are like in their early 20s, mid 20s. They're a single parent. They've just gotten clean, and they're saying like, I need to find one person to settle down with. What I'm looking for is to be married and have stability. I can't wait to get a job. I'm keeping alcohol out of my house. And they have a list of things that it's like, oh, these are the things that, I'm hearing that the other side's running away from. And how do we reconcile these without overcorrecting, right?
Yeah. So it touches on what you guys are both saying, but it also goes back to what you were saying, Paul, with the question like, so how do we bring together psychology in the church? How are those supposed to marry? And the way that we've gone about it is, you see the biblical categories as the master categories. So the overarching categories through which you understand things are the biblical categories. But counseling is about how do you help people grow and mature, right? Whatever the issue is, if it's trauma, if it's whatever, the question always is, how are you helping this person to develop and grow? And so the answer is, you need a whole stinking lot of wisdom, because each person and each situation is really, really different. And so you need a lot of wisdom. And so you guys are just playing with, there's different things different people need, right? Some people need beauty, some people need truth, some people need a firm hand, some people need extra rope to almost hang themselves with. There's different things we all need, but that's how I think you properly integrate psychology. Is you say there's a lot here to glean from which we can have much more wisdom when we come to people's cases. So when you tell me, my mom was borderline, there's a psychological category, right? I can say, okay, well, here's this cluster of symptoms. Which out of those things were true for you? What we know is that usually this is the case for kids who have parents like that. What out of that was true? And oftentimes people say, oh, I didn't know that was a thing, but I experienced that. I didn't have a word for it. I didn't. And you can map these patterns more quickly, and it's not 100% one for one, but it gets you further down the road, because it's just saying, what are the patterns that you see in people's lives when you have this constellation of relationships who operate in these ways? How does it tend to work itself out? And then you can take that and say, well, in that constellation of patterns with a parent like that, there's like 5 ways people usually react. What out of these ways maps the most? Is there something that's like a secondary one? And depending on their personality, depending on how they responded, their resilience, the other factors in their life, They'll have a little bit of a different, but it moves you forward faster when you have more wisdom, which you can glean from the information you can gather. But you have that master category, which says, this is our goal. Our goal is for you to mature and grow as a person. We're going to do that by developing you, and it's going to look different. You're going to need different things depending on where you're coming from. And one of the things with psychology too is pretty much every psychologist, I actually see each psychological system as being much more representative of that that person's own psychology. So Jung, when I read Jung, I get to know Jung, and I know the way Jung sees people. And when I read Freud, I see how Freud sees people. And there's a lot of diversity within psychology because there's a lot of diversity in how people are. But basically, a psychological system is a really great transference. I get to see everything about how you map the world because you tell me, oh, this means this and this means that, which doesn't necessarily mean that's true, but there's a certain set of people that will see it and experience it that way. And then when you find people, you find most of the time, there's a set that will match better. And so there'll be a system of thought and a way that they make connections, because you have people where CBT fits. They're super logical, they're super ordered, and CBT is a great fit. And there's most people hate CBT. They don't do it, they don't like it. Then you have people where it's like psychoanalytics. Yes, let's talk about my dreams. I've already been writing them down for 5 years. I love, they're there. And it's like, yeah, that's how you map reality. And so this is a language to speak to you. And so I think that issue that you guys were talking around, it's wisdom. And that's what would...
In your point, it's backed up by all the aggregate studies that say, well, at the end of the day, the treatment modality doesn't even really matter that much. When you shake it all out, all the numbers, they're basically the same. So, I hear psychologists say like, well, whatever your approach is, just make sure you believe it. Yeah. Like, okay.
Oh, I've heard that before. Well, we're cruising up on 2 hours here, and I don't want to keep you two all day. This has been wonderful, and I'd love to do this again sometime. I really wanted to do this just because, again, Kathryn, she's well known. I mean, you've written on Peugeot's blog, you're on the Bridges Meeting Discord fairly regularly, and so you're known here. But hardly anybody knows Eamon, so I wanted to get you on here too. And so I was really looking forward to this. So thank you to both for being willing to do this. Any last thoughts or comments that you wanted to make?
Give me a second to think.
I'm just really glad we're talking about this. I think that a lot of people within the church handle trauma with like a blunt instrument. They don't know what to do with it. It kind of scares them. So they tend to throw propositions at it, or then they outsource it and say, well, why don't you go see a psychologist, because we can't handle this here. And so I think the church doesn't historically handle this very well. And at the same time, obviously I'm biased, I'm a Christian. I think that the secular answers get you pretty far, but because it comes down to identity, purpose, meaning, they can often give you a lot of the tools, but then you're left kind of holding the bag, and it doesn't get you to where you potentially could go. It might get you out of a hole, but it might not get you up the mountain. And so I really think
you could be a preacher, get you out of a hole, but not up the mountain. That's a good line. That's a really good line. It's a good image.
Okay. But I think that this is a pivotal conversation for our culture to figure out right now, especially because it's tied in with identity, which across the board, I think we're struggling with refiguring out as a society. So it's good.
Yeah. I'm very interested in how the conversation, even just more broadly, goes on this topic. Psychology, I think, as a field, is becoming a little more self-aware. The saying used to go, what was it, that first psychology lost its soul, then it lost its mind. We went sort of behaviorism, and that with postmodernity, what it's done is forced psychology as a field to discuss values, and to realize that they are always operating at every level, that there's increasing debate about, like, well, okay, we're able to define what's pathological, and we're going to take a very pragmatic approach, say that's what doesn't work for a person. It's causing dysfunction in some level. There's this big hole of like, okay, but what are we aiming towards? And I think it's critical for the church to be thoughtful about this if they want to have a seat at the table and contribute. And there's a real opportunity for it. The other last thought would just be, don't be afraid of people who've been traumatized. You hear their stories, people tend to back away. I hear people say that there's just, it's met with silence and then it's never brought up again. And maybe people aren't returning their calls after they open up about what's happened. And you don't have to fix it. They're not expecting you to fix it. You don't need to find an answer to give to the person. Being someone who is present and listening, and probably in most cases, it's better to say very little beyond that you heard them and that you care about them. And that's that communal piece that I think, whether you're a Christian or not, we all agree that that's critical, and that's what's in front of us right now. Otherwise, we'll just see the fruits of unaddressed trauma continue to tear apart our society. But I'm hopeful that won't happen. And there's a lot of good things that are happening. And I hope we get to have another conversation sometime about this.
I'm sure we will. Well, and what you said, Eamon, too, people don't recognize how frightening it is for people when they even just hearing a testimony of trauma, especially in person. On TV, it's a little bit removed on a screen, but in person, I mean, I see that all the time in church when someone comes in and expresses pain, especially often it's the traumatized, like, I can't do pain. No. And they shut them off and they push them away. And it's like, okay, yeah, there's pain, and that probably triggered some things in you, and you felt some things, but stay with me here. You're gonna be okay. But that's all. And developing that, so much of that agency is developed in people through modeling. Oh, I saw the pastor. The pain didn't swallow the pastor. No, pain didn't swallow the pastor. Pastor's okay. We're now losing our heads here. Everything's all right. We can talk. It's all right. I mean, it's so much, some of that stuff, it's just such basic stuff, but it's like, just calm people down. We're going to be okay here. And then slowly build their agency and their endurance in it. So all those silly pastor tricks that we use. Well, I'm going to end the recording, and then I'm going to thank you both. But anything you want to, I mean, Kathryn, you've written some stuff for the Symbolic World. Anything, I don't know, you guys don't have a lot to promote, but you can find Kathryn on the Bridges of Meaning Discord server. Eamon's, he's behind the scenes, but he's reading and watching.
She keeps trying to convince me to participate, so maybe I'll dip my toe in.
Well, it's a lot. I mean, a lot of people write me, say, that's Discord, that's a lot. It's a lot. So anyway, thank you both.